Hi, friends. So it's summertime, and I thought maybe we could be outdoors for our little chats about faith and about how to live our faith in Christ. Okay, so Matthew 8. Matthew 8, when I was reading it, starts at verse 23 and it goes to verse 27. You can look it up. It prompted this question in me when I was reading and praying with it recently. How many storms does it take in life for us to go through until we finally trust in the Lord? Just how many storms? We all go through storms, right? And storms, like the proverbial storms, meaning like troubles in our lives, they're unavoidable. Whether we're Christian or we're not Christian, we're going to have storms. And we're going to have a good deal of them throughout the course of our lives. So they can either be wasted or we can gain a great deal from them. We can either, every time we're in the midst of them, be confused and angry and run away from them, blame God for them, try to distract ourselves from them, any number of responses or reactions. Or we could see that there's a purpose to every storm in our lives. I think it's when we start to see that there can be great gain going through the storm and having gone through the storm that we begin to see the meaning of that beautiful story of Jesus getting into a boat with some of his disciples and setting out to sea and falling asleep. And a storm comes about. You know the story. So Jesus is in this boat and he's asleep, and all of a sudden this great storm begins to happen and it freaks the disciples out. And they're looking at Jesus saying, how can this guy sleep? So they go and they wake him up and they ask, Lord, save us. We're going to drown. What's his response? You have little faith. Why are you so afraid? And that's us going through the storms. I don't know if it's you. I know a lot of times it's me, and I'm a priest. It shakes my faith, or I see just how little my faith is, and just how afraid I can be when I go through hard times. What about you? And so what Jesus does is he stands up and he rebukes the storms, and they're calm. And the men, they are amazed, Matthew tells us, and they question, they say, what kind of man is this that even the waves and the winds obey? So let's go through a little bit of that and see how that can affect our lives. One way or the other, storms are going to affect our lives. So how to deal with storms as Christians and not be tossed and turned in the fear, but grow, in fact, in faith and trust and closer to the Lord. Because I think that ultimately that's the purpose of each and every storm. Okay. So we have storms, right? And for some of us, we have a lot of them, and definitely all of us, we have our fair share of them throughout our lives. Whenever we go through storms, I think that what happens in Matthew chapter 8, even the sequence of them, lends insight on how to navigate storms. The first thing is that Jesus seems to be asleep. When we go through storms, a lot of times we think that God's not paying attention to our lives, right? And we call out to him, but we call out to him in such a way that we want him to hear us, and we want him to address the storm the way that we believe that he should address the storm. And when he doesn't, we think that he's asleep, or he's not paying attention to us, or that for any number of things that we've done in our lives, we don't deserve what it is that we're calling out to him to give to us. We think that we're not lovable, that he doesn't love us, or that he's punishing us. That's a good one, right? That the storm is happening in my life because I did A, B, or C earlier on in my life. And so God's going to not only cause this storm, but he's going to make me ride it out. Well, friends, that's not God. And if you have trouble believing in that God, I understand why. Because that God actually doesn't exist. And we would have trouble believing in a God that doesn't exist, meaning a God of our own making, a God as we envision it, rather than the God that's presented to us in the gospel. And yet, a lot of us find ourselves in that proverbial boat, right? Angry at God, blaming God, thinking that we're to blame for this, and that this is punishment for us, or that God is not answering us, so God doesn't exist. That's another good one, right? We find a lot of people in our lives right now dealing with God, the making of that God, their own making of that God, in that way, and therefore not believing in Him. He doesn't exist. He doesn't exist because look at all the troubles in the world, and He's not fixing them the way we think He needs to fix them. So therefore, He doesn't exist, and many of us walk away from Him. But look what happens in the gospel. Yes, Jesus is attentive. Jesus is asleep. But why is He asleep? Because He's the Lord of the wind and the waves, right? He's in control. Even when we don't think He's in control, or even when we want Him to be in control the way that we want Him to be controlled, He's actually the one in control. And so while we're worried and fearful and anxious about the stuff that we're going through, He's not. He's not. And so I love that this experience, this episode from Christ's life, but also the deep that it teaches us is so much more than what we read here on the surface. So what's it cause the disciples to do? It causes the disciples to call out to Jesus. Now this is an important one also. Lord, save us. We're going to drown. Here's the thing, absent of storms in our lives. Living in the fallen world that we live in, and drawn to concupiscence. That means that we're drawn to things other than God, right? That's part of our fallen nature. Especially the stuff that God doesn't want us to have, or when we have it, too much of it, we get distracted. So absent of storms in our lives, we're prone to think that all is well and fine, not only in my life, but in the world. And so guess what we do? We go to sleep. We stop paying attention to God. We stop listening to Him. We stop thinking of Him. We stop caring of Him. Oh, I'm not talking about on an intellectual level or a level of emotion, feeling love for God on any given day and believing that God exists. Yes, we continue to believe that He exists, and we have sometimes these warm fuzzies about God. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about taking our eyes off of God and putting them on other things. Putting them on our work. Putting them on too much on other relationships. Putting all of our eggs in those baskets. Putting them on our own pursuit of pleasure and entertainment, like binge watching TV. Putting them on things that we find ourselves attracted to and eventually attached to and ultimately then addicted to, and then we can't get our eyes off of them. Now, there are a host of things that happen in the absence of storms that we tend to put our eyes upon other things and just simply start coasting through life. And eventually then what happens with that is us going to sleep and us not thinking about God. It's the slow fade away from a belief that God even exists or that He matters in our lives. I mean, just think about the classic example of this, right? Sunday mornings come along, and we have a host of other things that we want to get done because this is my day off. And so we go off and do any number of those sort of things, thinking that in the beginning, it'll be just this Sunday, just for this occasion, just for this ball game, just for this family gathering, just for this beautiful Sunday morning, an opportunity to go out on the boat or go golfing, whatever, right? The excuses that we make. But do it often enough as becomes the habit, and have your life going along the way that you created it, in the way that you want to see it happen, in the way that you pursue. It's a slow fade into slumber. And slumber long enough, you can see how many people struggle with their belief in God because they have simply taken their mind off of God. It's not that they're bad people, and not that they're doing bad things. So that's one of the things to keep in mind when we consider what Jesus is trying to teach us by this experience in his life, but also even the order of what happens here. That when the storm happens, the disciples call out to Jesus. They put their eyes back on the Lord. They think of him. They recognize their need for him. They pray to him. They petition him. They ask for his assistance. And sometimes that's the purpose of a storm. But here's the thing about these storms is that mistake that we can make is that we think that God calls the storm. But go back and read Matthew chapter 8, starting at verse 23. The disciples went out with the Lord on the boat, and suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake. And it caused the waves to be swept and the boat to be tossed and turned. Jesus didn't cause the storm, right? The storm is caused by many and various things in our fragile world. From nature, from the sins of others, from our own sins, from accidents, from losses. The list is endless, right? But it doesn't mean that God caused them. But what it does mean in this gospel reading is that the disciples were close enough to Jesus, physically close to them, and close enough in their hearts and their relationships to know that he can make a difference. And so they called out to Jesus. So that's a purpose of the storm. A very important purpose is that it causes us to wake from our slumber and to reach out for Jesus again. And that alone is an excellent thing, even as we're going through a very difficult thing. But it doesn't stop there. Jesus replies to the disciples, and God knows how many times to us, right? You of little faith, why are you so afraid? Isn't that a great question as we go through storms? Why am I so afraid of this storm? How many storms is going to take in my life for me not to be afraid and for me to trust that God has got this and God's in the midst of this? And God is going to use this as a way to draw me closer to him. So he rebukes them and he rebukes us in a gentle and a loving and consistent way. So what then happens? He gets up. He rebukes then the winds and the waves, and it's completely calm. Okay, so here's a couple of thoughts along those lines. When we read this gospel, I want that. Whenever I call out to God, I want him immediately to rebuke the winds and the waves and to calm the storm. It happened in the gospel, right? Yeah, you're right. It did happen in the gospel. And there are many times when Jesus addresses things, both in teaching or in action, and immediate results happen. But there are other times when he addresses things and it's not the first pass, I think about the man who is born blind, right? And Jesus applies spittle and mud to his eyes, and he asks him to open them. And at first, the man sees people as like trees or something like that. And Jesus goes back at it again. And ultimately the man is healed, meaning sometimes healings and sometimes the addressing of our problems takes time and goes through waves and series and a variety of events in order for God's will to be accomplished rather than our will, and of his timing rather than our timing. But here in today's gospel, Jesus stands up and he calms the seas. That will be the case sometimes in our lives, but other times in our lives it will not. But if we think that it has to be the case every time, then we fall back into those same categories we were talking about earlier: blaming God, walking away from God, and any number of other reactions that we have that won't accomplish the purpose of the storm. After that, what happens? The gospel writer says that the men were amazed and they asked, "What sort of man is this, that even the waves and the winds obey him?" Beautiful, right? Part, I think, of the reasons that we have storms in our lives is so that we can see the power of God. Going back to when everything is hunky-dory and fine and dandy, we forget God. And we also forget his great power in our life. And we forget his lordship over our lives. So here God demonstrates his lordship even over the winds and the waves. And then he therefore demonstrates his power. And what does it do? It puts the men in awe and wonder. A big part of the Christian life is that we're supposed to be in awe and wonder first and foremost of God, rather than all of his creatures and created things. And yet, when all things are going in well and everything is great in life, we spend so much of our times being awe and wonder of creatures and created things, don't we? Of our handheld devices, of our monies, of our toys, of our image, of what other people think of us, of the clothes that we wear, of our health, and any number of other good things. The creature and the created things become our God that we worship. You know what worship means? It's to call another worthy. And when we call other things more worthy of our awe and wonder, we are worshiping them over worshiping God. And so sometimes the storm comes along, and yes, it shakes us up, no doubt about it. And it does strike fear in us. We are human, right? But it should then cause us to call out to God. No matter how he addresses that storm, ultimately he will show his power, and it will bring us back to an awe and wonder of him and break the spell that we have on so many other things. Have you ever heard the saying go that when something bad happens to a person, it gives them perspective? They realize what's really important in life and what's not important in life. That's exactly what's going on here. Then when we are in awe and wonder of God, we are really capable of loving him the way that he deserves to be loved, in the way that we deserve to love. We're capable now, in awe and wonder of him, of truly worshiping him. And here's the thing about worship. Worship doesn't bring happiness to God. God's complete and fulfilled. It brings happiness to us, because we start doing what we're created to do, and that is to be in this right relationship with God that then makes right all other things in our lives, even storms. Here's a final word. Having gone through the storm then, because we will, how many times have you gotten through the storms in your life, and me through the storms in my life, right? Having gone through those storms, then we look back. They say hindsight is 20/20, right? Well, that's the case here. Having looked back and gone through this experience as Matthew describes, and the sequence of it, we look back and we see God. We see him in the storm with us all along. We see that he never left the boat. He was always with us. He was always in control. He was always calm. He was always present to us and always capable of calming those winds and those waves. And sometimes it does take us going through it and then looking back and seeing that. But then, if that's really the only time, and for some of us it is, the only time that we really see him, like footprints in the sand, the beautiful story that everyone knows, where the man looks back and only sees 1 foot of footprints in the sand, and he's like, where with me? You said you were going to be with me all the time. And the Lord says, I was with you all the time. It was during the times when you were struggling the most that I carried you. And sometimes it takes us looking back to see that. It's called reflection. Spiritual reflection allows us then to see him. And when we see him, we fall more in love with him. Our heart grows in gratitude. We appreciate him. And that grows our love for him more and more. All that is accomplished by a storm. So, my first question is my last question. And it's not just to you, it's to me. It is a human question. How many storms will it take in life until we finally trust? Until next time, thanks.